Hello, my name is Abby Huang, and in this video I'll be analyzing my final infographic on what the global refugee crisis looks like in 2018. This is a topic that I wanted to learn a little bit more about since there's a lot of dense information as to what exactly is going on, especially in the news, and hopefully this could help make it a little bit more digestible for not only myself, but for other people as well. On the right, you can see what my infographic looks like in its entirety, but I'll spend the rest of this video going through the design decisions it took me to get there. First, I'm going to go through the models that I chose for my project. For my visual language model, I utilized line thickness that was thin, straight, mostly horizontal to section off the different facts and infographics. And then I also used the shapes. They were really dependent on round, perfect circles in the charts, labels, and images of, for example, the globe. For fills, I used full bold fills with the occasional diagonal pattern fill, and it had thick outlines of circles. My infographic doesn't deal with any photographs. I did include one, but I'll touch on that later. And then in terms of cropping, it's exclusively a cutout of the incomplete object. For textures, I utilized patterns, but mostly in the form of repeating icons. And then the gradients, there weren't any real gradients that were being used. Shading was used minimally to make sort of a 3D effect. And then there's some use of minimal transparency. The level of realism used in my infographic are very lifelike and complete cutouts. They're detailed, like they could have been based off of photographs, but because they have these detailed edges, but they don't have any interior details, so they're like silhouettes. I noted that there's also a lot of action happening in these graphics to exude more realism, like the birds taking flights or the turtle swimming. So you essentially create graphics, and the black text or black detailing helps kind of bring that to life, which I'll utilize. In terms of my layout model, my model is really dependent on clear sections and nested groups of sections, and they use a lot of line treatments and spacing to define them. There's a fair amount of symmetry to suggest the equal importance of the sections or the facts that they may hold, and you can see that it's generally broken up into about 2 or 3 columns vertically. The model is more of a wider vertical layout, and it has similarly distributed content in the middle, but very clear start and end points with the big blocks for where it starts and begins. The 2 main fonts that I used in my infographics was Source Serif Pro in semi-bold for the main title and the body text that follows it. And this is generally 25 to 30 points, while the Open Sans was used for everything else in regular weight, especially for the precision, identity, and axes labels, and then also for numbers. And then otherwise, it was used in the lightweight throughout the graphic, ranging from 3 to 7 point font. And generally, only the first word in every sentence is capitalized. While this model is pretty wordy, there are also often short, detailed descriptions, distinguished by the adequate use of subheaders and titles. And then also noted that all text is left aligned except for titles, which can be centered. And otherwise, the overall tone of these typefaces together gives a sense of serious, but also formal and practical displays of information. Next, I'll be going through the 5 forms of visual potential that I've utilized in my infographic. First is the appearance display, and this is the potential to communicate how something looks using imagery and recognizable characters or situations. For my display, I wanted to show some elements that refugees may have to deal with as they make their difficult journeys when they leave their countries, including the setting of war with the fighter planes, crumbling infrastructure of the bricks on the path that they're walking along, and then the aid that they might receive through parachutes, and kind of giving a sense of this chaosy or urgency through these open flames on the bricks. I emulated my visual model by using realistic icons and distinction between the land or sea and the sky, with lines separating the different parts of the title, and copied the layout of a very clear starting beginning section at the top that reads downwards. I struggled initially with this character family as a realistic silhouette because over and over in my critiques, people couldn't understand that it was a family being on the move, with the dad carrying a baby and then everyone carrying foil blankets. But through the image trace tool, I was able to achieve a sort of abstraction between the clear photograph and then also the realistic icon state of an image in action, which conveyed my visual layout very well. I also chose to do this because the vectors that I was finding were either very, very abstract or also very cartoony or very politically incorrect. And I think this is a fair representation of what a refugee's appearance might look like. In terms of color model, I took advantage of the black-gray background used to emphasize important context in my color model, and I kept the text white. And then for my typography, I used the semi-bold Source Serif Pro font with a much smaller subtitle text. So for relationship displays, the visual potential of this is to show connections between or relationships between things. And the information I wanted to portray here was to debunk that refugees do not in fact typically flock to wealthy countries like the US, but instead in much larger amounts go to regions that are nearby them for shelter. I chose a Sankey diagram for this so I can better encode the population numbers to size, but also the direction of travel is encoded with line treatment of the arrowhead and interactions in the way that the lines merge and separate. Since the major sources of the refugee crisis, for example in Syria, will end up across multiple countries. The size of the lines from also major countries of origin to the destination country also aids the viewer visually. In terms of the layout and visual layout, language model, the texture of the Sankey diagram was trying to emulate the pattern of fishes, the different fishes migrating, maintaining the section with also the blue lines that separate the section. And then I also used a typography model for emulating the open sans with regular weight given to the numbers in the title and then lightweight for the other text. I also stuck to the alternating blues and yellows for my color model to make sure that the more prominent blues and yellows represent the major countries, and then use the less used colors to represent the smaller countries. The visual potential for time is able to communicate when events occur or when they have occurred in time relative to each other using a relative position on a page. And this display shows time spatially, but it shows that contrary to how it is portrayed in the media, that the global refugee crisis didn't just come out of nowhere. We've actually been seeing a consistent rise in internationally displaced people in the past 10 years, and less of them are actually refugees. The visual language model didn't really have any bar charts, but it proved difficult to display time using circles. So instead I tried to emulate my model by creating an icon in my graphic while maintaining the sectioned portions, the blocked text, and then also highlighting the number in yellow as a nod to my color model. And I also turned the bar chart on the side so it kind of maintained this horizontal left to right read. And then again, I also maintained the typography of open sans, utilizing the more bold in the title. In my numbers display, I really wanted to show the proportion of refugees who are hosted by developing regions rather than developed regions, aka the first world countries. And this a list of the most common encodings for numbers would include size, height, width, length, brightness, amount, position on a grid. And then the ones for certain categories, which this would be hue, shape, etc. And I felt like the isotype chart was the best use of icons for a display to represent the proportion, and it could be really well represented using the appearance of the object that they're representing, which represents my VL very well. In terms of my location display, I wanted to utilize the visual potential to communicate positions of things or places relative to each other in the world. And so I used a map that would show using labels of country names and then also population of refugees coming from that country by use of proximity and leader lines. I wasn't able to use the isotype charts of icons due to proximity of the countries being highlighted. It made it very hard to read, but instead I utilized the circles with the diagonal fills to label elements and still used realistic icons to help explain the kind of conflict that was causing these refugees to leave these countries. Just like how my visual language model uses specific fish icons to show what fish is caught there. It is also used against an abstracted, undetailed map and kind of uses the same legend conventions. In terms of where this would be on my layout, it just matches where the map is on my layout model. I stuck to the color conventions of using yellow as a highlight. And then I also used the Source Serif Pro font for the title of the map. I wanted to also take some time to talk about visual hierarchy within my infographic. Visual hierarchy means the variation in visual elements that in an area that are displayed. helping viewers know which elements they should pay more attention to in what sequence. And it can also convey importance by having more prominent elements than others, which my display does by having a very strong space allocation to the top and bottom displays, with fairly equally distributed sections in between, kind of giving this sense of equality and importance. The consistency in white space and the sections with the blue lines creates a kind of repetition that also gives a sense of how important the middle section is compared to one another. I also created interest within my visual hierarchy by having really dramatic differences in visual prominence that makes my reader take more time to absorb the detail in the header of the infographic, such as when the family is walking across a very difficult road. The color is also very completely different from the rest of the infographic, which causes a good amount of contrast. And the map also creates a very dynamic display by being so big and taking up the whole horizontal section and having very different types of visual language than the middle sections. In terms of alignment and unity and variety, my displays are typically left aligned like my typography and visual language models, with the exception of the titles and top and bottom sections. I also create unity across my visual attributes by sticking to my strong blue and yellow color palette, alternating between the uses of those two. I also maintain the shape of my sections and the size of the sections, as well as consistent font and texture throughout the infographic. I create variety, though, with different icons that have different textures and edges. The sizes of circles are also used to show different proportions, and so some seem more important than the others. And then I also use different hues of the main blue and yellow colors that are from my color model to kind of give that more variety in color. So that was kind of an explanation of some of the design decisions that I made in my final infographic. I hope that explains it well.